Totemist. Brother's final canvas. My brother Federico had a way of seeing things the rest of us missed. When we were kids, he'd point to ordinary shadows and describe entire worlds hidden inside them. Mom called it his artist's eye. Dad called it daydreaming. I just thought he was special. We grew up in a small house at the edge of Pinewood, Michigan, where the trees grew so thick behind our property that sunlight barely touched the ground. Those woods always frightened me, but Federico loved them. He'd sit at the edge for hours with his sketchbook, capturing the way light filtered through the leaves or how fog curled between tree trunks at dawn. "Look, Lucia," he'd say, showing me drawings that somehow made those scary woods look magical. "See how the trees are talking to each other." Federico's talent was obvious even then. His paintings didn't just show you what something looked like. They showed you how it felt. A sunset through his eyes wasn't just colors in the sky. It was like watching the day take its last breath. His art made you feel things you couldn't name. By the time he finished high school, everyone expected him to get a scholarship to some fancy art school. But then Dad got sick, and the medical bills piled up, and suddenly there wasn't money for college anymore. Federico took a job at the hardware store, painting only on weekends and late nights when everyone else was asleep. I'd find him in the garage we'd converted to a studio, surrounded by canvases, his hands stained with paint. "You should be sleeping," I'd tell him. He'd just smile that tired smile of his. "Sleep can wait. The pictures in my head can't." When Dad passed, something shifted in Federico. His paintings grew darker, more intense. People in town started noticing. Mr. Henley, from the local gallery, offered to display some of his work. "This could be your chance," I told him, but Federico just shrugged. "No one buys art in Pinewood," he said, "and Mom needs help with the bills." That's when he got the idea to travel, to take his art to places where people might actually buy it. Big cities, art fairs, anywhere he could set up an easel and try to sell his vision to strangers. "I'll send money home," he promised Mom, who tried not to cry as she helped him pack the old station wagon with canvases and paints. "Just come back to us," she said, hugging him tight. I watched him drive away that April morning, not knowing it was the beginning of losing him. The first few months, Federico called often. He'd tell us about Boston, New York, Philadelphia, cities I'd only seen in movies. He sounded excited, alive, but the money he sent home was never much. "People love looking," he explained during one call, "but they don't love buying." As summer stretched into fall, the calls became less frequent. When he did phone, his voice sounded distant, stretched thin, like he was fading away even as we spoke. "How's the art selling?" I asked during one call. "It's the materials," he said after a long pause. "I can't afford good paints anymore. People can tell." I imagined my brother in some distant city, using watered-down colors to chase his dreams. The image haunted me. Mom started keeping his room exactly as he'd left it. Dirty laundry, still in the hamper. Bed unmade. Like a shrine to the son who now existed mainly in poorly connected phone calls. By winter, Federico had made it to the West Coast. His voice on the phone was different somehow, faster, more scattered. He talked about colors I'd never heard of, about how the light in California was revealing things to him. "Things?" I asked. "What things, Federico?" "The spaces between," he said cryptically. "The thin places where worlds touch." I told myself it was just artist talk, but something in his voice, sent a cold finger down my spine. When spring came around again, almost a year since he'd left, the calls all but stopped. We'd get postcards with no return address, just quick notes saying he was okay, he was working, he'd send money soon. Then one day, a package arrived. Inside were 3 small paintings, unlike anything Federico had done before. They showed forests, but not any forest I recognized. The trees seemed alive in ways trees shouldn't be. Their branches like reaching arms, their trunks twisted into almost faces. But it was the shadows that frightened me most. They seemed to contain movement, figures, like there were people trapped inside them. Mom hung them in the living room. "They're different," she said, "but beautiful." I couldn't look at them without feeling watched. A week later, we got a call from a hospital in Oregon. Federico had been found wandering a highway at night, talking to people who weren't there. When the police picked him up, he couldn't tell them his name or where he was from. They found our number in his wallet. "He's having some kind of breakdown," the doctor told us. "Does he have a history of mental illness?" He didn't. Federico had always been sensitive, different, but never unstable. Until now. Mom took all our savings and flew out west. I stayed behind, partly because we couldn't afford 2 tickets, partly because I was afraid of what I might find. She called me from the hospital. "He doesn't recognize me," she said, her voice breaking. "He keeps talking about a forest, about souls trapped in trees. He says he needs to paint them to set them free." A week later, she brought him home. The doctors had prescribed medication that made his movements slow and his eyes vacant. He wasn't Federico anymore, not the brother who'd shown me magic and shadows. He was a ghost of himself, haunting our house with empty eyes. We set up his studio again, hoping familiar surroundings might bring him back. Sometimes he'd paint, but the images were different now, chaotic, fragmented. Forests again and again, but forests no human had ever walked through. "Where is this place?" I asked him once as he painted feverishly. His brush paused. "The Forest of Souls," he answered, his voice suddenly clear. "It's where lost people go. It's waiting for me." I told myself it was just delusions, the illness talking. I didn't think about the local legends, the stories old-timers told about the deep woods beyond Pinewood, where hikers sometimes disappeared without a trace. Those were just stories to scare kids away from wandering too far into the trees. Federico seemed to improve over summer. The medication was adjusted, and glimpses of my real brother returned. He'd laugh sometimes, would sit with Mom and me at dinner and actually talk. But he wouldn't go near the woods behind our house, and he kept the curtains drawn on windows facing that direction. "It's calling me," he told me one night, but I'm trying not to listen. Then came the October night when everything changed. I woke to the sound of the back door closing. Through my bedroom window, I saw a figure at the edge of our yard. Federico, in his pajamas, staring into the woods. I ran downstairs and out onto the dew-wet grass. "Federico," I called, "come back inside." He turned to look at me, and in the moonlight, his face seemed peaceful for the first time in months. "I understand now, Lucia," he said. "I need to go there to finish my work. There are so many stories waiting to be painted." "Go where?" I asked. though I already knew. He smiled, that old Federico smile that could break your heart with its gentleness. The forest of souls. I've been seeing it in pieces, but now I need to see it whole. There's no such place, I said, reaching for him. Come inside. You're not well. But he stepped back, just beyond my grasp. I've always seen things others don't, he said. That doesn't make them not real. Before I could move, he turned and ran into the woods. I chased him, calling his name, but the darkness swallowed him. I stood at the tree line, afraid to go deeper, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading, until there was nothing but the wind in the leaves. The police searched for days. They brought dogs, volunteers, even a helicopter. They found nothing. No footprints beyond a certain point. No scraps of clothing. Nothing to suggest a human had passed that way. People don't just vanish, the sheriff told us, but his eyes said something different. Mom broke in ways that can never be fixed. She still sets a place for Federico at dinner sometimes, still keeps his room ready for his return. I've moved back home to take care of her, to make sure she eats and takes her medication. 3 months after Federico disappeared, I finally gathered the courage to go into his studio. Everything was as he'd left it. Brushes still soaking in murky water, half-finished canvases leaning against walls. But on the easel was something new, a painting I'd never seen before. It showed the forest behind our house, but transformed. The trees had faces, the shadows had depth, and among them, barely visible unless you knew to look, was a figure with Federico's distinctive profile. He was painting at an easel, surrounded by dozens of transparent shapes that might have been people. He looked happy. I didn't show the painting to Mom or the police. I hung it in my bedroom where I can see it when I wake up. Some nights, I swear the figures in it move, shifting positions between dusk and dawn. Some nights, I think I can hear Federico's voice carried on the wind that moves through the trees behind our house. Come see what I found, it seems to say. Come see what I'm painting now. They say art shows us things we can't otherwise see. I think Federico finally found the ultimate canvas, a place where his visions and reality are one and the same, a place where he can paint forever, bringing to life all the things only he could see. I just wish he'd found a way to do it without leaving us behind. Hollow hymns. I've been playing the organ at St. Margaret's for 7 years now. Every Sunday, my fingers press the same keys, produce the same sounds, accompany the same hymns. But lately, something has changed. The notes feel empty, like echoes in a space that used to be filled with meaning. It started gradually, a quiet doubt here, a silent question there. The sermons I once absorbed now wash over me like water over stone. The prayers feel mechanical, practiced motions without substance. When I play, the congregation sings with perfect timing, but I've started to wonder if they feel anything at all. Beautiful service today, Pastor Reed always says, his hand firm on my shoulder. Thank you, I always reply, though inside I'm wondering what exactly makes it beautiful. I was raised to believe without question. Faith was our family's backbone. My father would quote scripture at dinner. My mother would lead us in prayer before bed. Questions weren't encouraged. God works in mysterious ways was the answer to everything that didn't make sense. But now, sitting at the organ bench every Sunday, watching the congregation from my elevated position, I see things differently. The repetition, the routine, the way people's eyes glaze over during prayers, the way they check watches during sermons. Are they feeling what they're supposed to feel? Am I? These thoughts follow me home from church, linger during the week, and return stronger each Sunday. The organ, once my connection to something greater, now feels like just wood and pipes and keys, just mechanics and physics producing sound. The phone call came on a Tuesday. First Covenant Church in Millbury needs an organist for their weekend revival, Pastor Reed explained. Their regular player is ill. I recommended you. I almost refused. More church services were the last thing I wanted, but something in the way he described Millbury caught my attention. They're very devoted there, he said, choosing his words carefully. A different kind of worship than what we practice. Different how? I asked. A pause. More direct, he finally said. You'll see. Millbury was 3 hours away, nestled in hills that seemed to curve around the town like protective arms, or prison walls. I couldn't decide which as I drove in Friday afternoon. First Covenant sat on the town's highest point, a stone building with narrow windows that reminded me more of a fortress than a place of worship. I arrived early to practice and found the church unlocked, but empty. The organ was older than mine at home, its keys yellowed with age. When I played the first notes, the sound hung in the air differently, heavier, more substantial. For the first time in months, I felt something while playing. A vibration that wasn't just in my fingertips, but somewhere deeper. People began arriving at 6. I watched them from behind the organ, noting their uniformity, not in appearance, but in movement. They entered at regular intervals, sat with perfect posture, smiled with identical timing. When they sang, their voices blended so completely it was impossible to distinguish one from another. The pastor, a tall man with pale eyes, preached about revelation. True knowledge comes to those who seek it, he said, his voice rising and falling in rhythmic patterns, not from books or buildings, but from direct communion. The congregation swayed slightly as he spoke, as if moved by a gentle, unseen current. I found myself swaying too, caught in whatever force held them in its grip. After the service, a woman approached me. "I'm Eliza," she said. Her voice was the first normal thing I'd heard all evening. "You play beautifully." "Thank you," I said, surprised by how genuine my response felt. Unlike the others, Eliza's movements seemed natural, her smile imperfect but warm. "You're not from here," she observed. "Just visiting, filling in." She studied me for a moment. "You're searching for something, I can tell." The accuracy of her assessment startled me. "Maybe. We all are," she said. "That's why we're here." She leaned closer. "The service tomorrow night, the real one after the official one, might interest you." "What do you mean, the real one?" "We gather in the woods behind the church. No hymns, no sermons, just direct experience." She handed me a small card with an address. "Come if you want answers. 10 o'clock. I should have said no. I should have been suspicious. But when she mentioned answers, something inside me responded. The questions I'd been carrying for months suddenly felt heavy, unbearable. What if there really were answers? Saturday's service was like Friday's, but more intense. The singing was louder, the sermon more fervent. The pastor spoke about barriers between worlds, about thinning veils and ancient knowledge. Throughout it all, I felt Eliza watching me from the third pew, her gaze steady when others' eyes seemed unfocused. After the service, I returned to my motel room and stared at the card she'd given me. The sensible part of me said to pack up and drive home, but the questions that had been growing inside me for months demanded attention. What if this strange church in this strange town held answers I couldn't find at St. Margaret's? At 9:45, I left my motel and followed the directions on the card. The path led behind the church into woods that seemed to grow darker and more dense with each step. In the distance, I could see flickering light, not electric, but flame. The gathering was in a clearing. About 30 people stood in a circle around a bonfire, including most of the congregation from earlier. The pastor stood opposite the point where the path entered the clearing, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight. Eliza materialized beside me. "You came," she said, sounding genuinely pleased. "I'm not sure why," I admitted. "Yes, you are." She took my hand. "You came for the same reason we all did, to feel something real." The group was singing, but not hymns. This was older sounding, wordless tones that rose and fell like breath. As they sang, their faces changed. The uniformity I'd noticed earlier giving way to individual expressions of emotion I hadn't seen before. "Join us," Eliza urged, leading me toward the circle. They welcomed me in, shifting to make space. The heat of the fire pressed against my face, and the singing vibrated in my chest in a way church music never had. "We gather to seek direct communion," the pastor announced when the singing ended, "to bypass the empty rituals and connect with the knowledge that lives beyond ordinary awareness." An older woman passed around small clay cups filled with dark liquid. When she reached me, Eliza whispered, "It's just tea, herbs that help quiet the mind." I hesitated, but everyone else was drinking. I raised the cup to my lips and sipped cautiously. It tasted earthy, bitter, but not unpleasant. "Now, we open ourselves," the pastor said, his voice different here, less performative, more authentic. "We ask to receive what we need to know." The group fell silent, eyes closed, heads tilted slightly upward. I followed their example, not sure what I was supposed to experience. At first, nothing happened. Then, gradually, I began to feel strange, not dizzy or confused, but intensely present. The sounds of the forest seemed sharper, every rustling leaf, every distant owl, the heat of the fire more precise on my skin. Colors, when I opened my eyes, more vibrant. "What is this?" I whispered to Eliza. "Awareness," she replied simply, without the filter of doctrine. Around the circle, people began to move in different ways. Some swayed, some remained perfectly still. Some whispered to themselves, some reached upward, as if trying to touch something invisible. And then I saw it, or thought I did. In the space above the fire, the air seemed to ripple, to part like a curtain. Behind it was something else. Not another world exactly, but a different perspective of this one, as if I were seeing everything from multiple angles simultaneously. The pastor spoke, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. This is the true communion, direct knowledge, unfiltered by ritual, by scripture, by centuries of interpretation. For a moment, I understood. All my questions about faith, about meaning, they suddenly seemed to stem from the artificiality of the church, the structured services, the rehearsed responses, the sanitized connection to something that should be wild and immediate. But then came fear, a sudden, primal surge of it, because what I was seeing, what I was feeling, it wasn't benevolent. It was ancient and indifferent. It didn't care about human needs or desires. It simply was. Around me, the others were fully immersed in whatever experience they were having. Some were speaking in languages I didn't recognize. Others had expressions of ecstasy on their faces. Eliza's head was tilted back, her eyes rolled upward, showing only whites. This wasn't communion. It was consumption. I backed away from the circle. No one seemed to notice. They were too absorbed in their experience. The pastor's eyes found mine briefly, and I saw recognition there. He knew I understood, but also that I was rejecting it. "It's too much for some," he said, his voice both kind and dismissive. "Go in peace." I walked away, then ran, stumbling through the dark woods until I found the path back to town. Behind me, the voices rose in that wordless song again, calling to whatever waited on the other side of that invisible curtain. In my motel room, I packed quickly, checked out despite the late hour, and drove all night. The highway stretched before me, mundane and reassuring in its ordinariness. I resigned from St. Margaret's the following week. I couldn't sit at that organ anymore, couldn't participate in what now seemed like a pale imitation of something more primal, more dangerous. Pastor Reed tried to understand. "Was it something at Millbury?" he asked, concern in his eyes. I considered telling him everything. The gathering, the tea, the vision above the fire. But what would be the point? He was comfortably nested in a version of faith that kept the wilderness at bay, that tamed the unknowable into Sunday sermons and familiar hymns. "I just need a change," I said instead. "I still believe in something greater than myself, but now I know it doesn't require my worship, my music, or my surrender. It simply exists, ancient and indifferent, neither good nor evil, but utterly other." And that knowledge, not the rituals of St. Margaret's or the ceremonies in Millbury's woods, is the real burden of faith. Broken window escape. There's something about the rhythm of my feet hitting the ground and the steady in and out of my breath that makes everything else fade away. That's why I started running through Oakwood Trail 3 years ago, rain or shine, almost every day. The trail winds through a forest preserve about half a mile from my apartment. It's not fancy, just a dirt path with mile markers every quarter mile and the occasional wooden bench for people who need a rest. But it's quiet, and the tall pines create this cathedral-like feeling I've come to depend on. I knew most of the regulars by sight, if not by name. There was Headphones Guy, who always wore bright orange shoes. There was Morning Twins, the elderly couple who power walked in matching windbreakers. And there was Yellow Hat, a woman about my age who nodded at me every time we passed each other. We were like planets in our own little solar system, orbiting the same path at different speeds. There was comfort in the predictability of it all, until there wasn't. It was a Tuesday in September when everything changed. The weather had just started to cool, and the morning air had that crisp edge that makes your lungs feel clean. I was about a mile and a half into my usual 3-mile loop when I saw him. A man was lying face down on the path ahead, one arm stretched out like he was reaching for something. He wore gray sweatpants and a dark blue hoodie. I didn't recognize him as one of the regulars. I slowed to a stop, catching my breath. "Hello? Are you okay?" No response. My heart rate, already up from running, kicked into a higher gear. I took a cautious step closer. "Sir, do you need help?" Still nothing. I pulled out my phone, ready to call 911, and approached him. That was my first mistake. As soon as I was within arm's reach, the man moved with shocking speed. His outstretched hand grabbed my ankle and yanked hard. I fell, my phone skittering away on the dirt path. "Hey!" I shouted, more angry than scared at first. "What are you doing?" The man was on his feet now, and I could see his face clearly. He was older than I'd thought, maybe in his 50s, with several days of stubble and eyes that were somehow both vacant and intensely focused. "Just need some help," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "At my house, right over there." He pointed toward a break in the trees I'd never noticed before. I could just make out what looked like the corner of a small structure through the foliage. I scrambled backward, trying to get my feet under me. "No thanks. I'm good. I'll just call someone for you." My hand felt for my phone, but before I could reach it, he grabbed my wrist. His grip was like iron. "I said I need help," he repeated, pulling me to my feet with surprising strength. I yanked my arm back, but he held firm. "Let go of me," I shouted, hoping someone else was nearby. "Help! Somebody help!" My voice seemed to disappear into the trees. The trail, usually dotted with other runners even on weekday mornings, was completely empty. The man started dragging me toward the break in the trees. I dug my heels into the dirt, pulled against his grip, even tried to drop my weight to the ground. Nothing worked. He just kept pulling, relentless, like this was something he'd done before. "Stop fighting," he muttered. "Just want to show you something. Won't take long." "Let me go," I screamed, louder than I've ever screamed in my life. My throat burned with the force of it. No response, but birds startled from trees. As we moved off the trail, fear crystallized into sharp and clear air in my chest. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Not to me. Not on my familiar trail. Not on a normal Tuesday morning. But it was. The house was more of a cabin. Small and weathered, with a sagging porch and windows so dirty they looked opaque. He pulled me up the steps, my feet catching on the warped boards. I stumbled, nearly fell, but his grip kept me upright. "Home sweet home," he said, with a smile that made my skin crawl. Then he shoved me through the door. The inside smelled of must and dirt. The main room contained only a table, a chair, and a hot plate in the corner. No pictures on the walls, no television, no signs of normal life. "What do you want?" I asked, hating how my voice trembled. He didn't answer, just pushed me toward another door. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading up to what I assumed was an attic. "No," I said, digging in my heels again. "I'm not going up there." His face changed then, hardened into something that wasn't quite human. "You'll go where I tell you. he growled, "or I'll knock you out and carry you up. Your choice." I believed him. That's the thing that still haunts me. How completely I believed he would hurt me without hesitation or remorse. So I climbed the stairs, each step taking me further from safety, from the normal world where bad things happen to other people on the news, not to me on a Tuesday morning run. The attic was small and stifling, with a sloped ceiling that forced me to hunch. A single window, small and dirty, let in meager light. There was a mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, and nothing else. "Wait here," he said, as if I had somewhere else to go. "I'll be back." He closed the door. I heard a lock slide into place. Time stretched in that room. Minutes felt like hours. I paced the small space, measuring it in steps. I examined the window, too small to climb through and sealed shut with paint. I pressed my ear to the floor, trying to hear what he was doing downstairs. Nothing. Just silence and the occasional creak of old wood. Panic built in my chest like water rising. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. This room would be where No. I stopped that thought cold. I wasn't going to let my mind go there. I needed to stay clear-headed. I needed to find a way out. I don't know how much time passed before I heard his footsteps on the stairs again. The lock slid back, and he entered carrying a plate with a sandwich and a glass of water. "Eat," he said, placing them on the floor. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "What do you want from me?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, like he was seeing me for the first time. "Company," he said simply. "Gets lonely out here." "You can't just take people because you're lonely," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "People will look for me. They'll find me." He smiled again, that terrible, empty smile. "No one ever comes this way. No one will hear you, so be quiet and eat your sandwich." He left again, locking the door behind him. I didn't touch the food. Instead, I went back to examining the room, more carefully this time. The window might be too small to climb through, but maybe the glass. Yes. If I could break it, I could signal someone, or use a shard to... I heard the front door open and close downstairs. Then silence. Had he left? I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like an eternity. No sounds from below. Nothing. This was my chance. I took off my running shoe and, using the heel, smashed it against the window as hard as I could. The glass cracked, but didn't break. I hit it again, harder. More cracks spiderwebbed across the surface. One more hit, and the glass shattered outward. I used my shoe to clear the sharp edges from the frame, then stuck my head through. Fresh air, trees, and below, about 15 feet down, the ground. It was too far to jump safely. But staying meant, well, nothing good. I listened again for any sound from downstairs. Still quiet. Decision made. I pushed as much of my upper body through the window as I could, then wriggled my hips through the narrow opening. It was tight, painfully so, but I managed to get through up to my thighs. I twisted onto my stomach, pushing with my knees until I was hanging from the windowsill by my hands, my body dangling against the side of the cabin. Then I let go. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs. Pain shot through my ankle, sharp and immediate. But I could move. I could stand. I could run. And run I did, despite the pain, despite the disorientation. I crashed through underbrush, branches scratching my face and arms, until I found the trail again. I turned right, toward where I thought the main road would be, and kept running. Every shadow looked like him. Every rustle in the trees sounded like footsteps, but I didn't stop. The trail ended at a parking lot, empty. I kept going, out to the road. Cars passed, normal Tuesday traffic. I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help. A blue sedan pulled over. The driver, a woman about my mom's age, rolled down her window. "Are you okay?" she asked, eyes wide at my wild appearance. "No," I gasped. "Please, I need to get to the police." "A man, he took me. Cabin in the woods." She unlocked her doors immediately. "Get in," she said. "I'll take you to the station right now." The police were kind, but seemed skeptical at first. My story sounded crazy even to my own ears, but they took my statement, photographed the scratches on my arms and the bruise developing on my ankle, and sent officers to search the trail immediately. 3 hours later, a detective came into the room where I was waiting. "We found the cabin," she said, her face strangely blank, "and we found him." Something in her voice made my skin prickle. Did he hurt anyone else?" She sat down across from me, folding her hands on the table. "We need you to look at some photographs, just to confirm this is the man who took you." The first photo she showed me was him. The same vacant eyes, the same stubbled face. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, that's him." She nodded and hesitated before continuing. "When we entered the cabin, he was arranging things." "What things?" I asked, though something in me didn't want to know. "Running shoes, dozens of them, different sizes, different brands, all women's shoes." She paused. Some looked very old, worn down to almost nothing. Others looked brand new. My stomach twisted. I thought of all the times I'd seen notices about missing hikers and runners in the area over the years, stories I'd scrolled past on social media, thinking how sad but how distant from my own safe life. "There's something else," the detective said. "The cabin shouldn't exist. That land is protected forest preserve. We checked the records going back 50 years. No structure was ever permitted there." "But it does exist," I said. "I was inside it." "Yes," she agreed. "It exists. He's in custody now. 3 months have passed since that day. My ankle healed, but other things haven't. Last week, I went to the station for a final update. The detective's office smelled like coffee and paper. She had dark circles under her eyes. "We found more than shoes," she said, sliding a folder across her desk. "We found notebooks, lists of runners, their routines, their routes, their habits. My name was in there. So were descriptions of what shoes I wore, what times I ran, even notes about which path I took when it rained." "How long was he watching me?" I asked. "Your name appears in entries dating back 14 months. 14 months, over a year of being observed, studied, tracked. While I ran my familiar path, feeling free, someone was making notes about me, like I was an animal being prepped for capture. The cabin is gone now. They demolished it after removing all the evidence. But sometimes I dream I'm still there, except the walls are made of running shoes, stacked floor to ceiling. In the dream, I can hear breathing coming from inside each pair." "Was he connected to the other disappearances?" I asked the detective. She hesitated, then nodded once. "We've confirmed 7 cases so far, all runners, all women. 7 women who didn't break a window. 7 women who didn't get away.